In many of the most popular reconstructions of Neanderthals, they almost always have light skin, and some even have blonde hair, red hair, and blue eyes. There are a ton of misconceptions around this, the most popular idea being that white people today, or Europeans, got these traits from Neanderthals, or on the totally opposite end, that there's no way Neanderthals actually look like this. Well, it's a bit complicated, but the first thing we can do to understand this is understand how light skin evolved via different methods in Homo sapiens. Light skin evolved via different genes in Europeans and East Asians. It's the idea of convergent evolution. Random mutations are occurring all the time, and then they are reinforced by the environment. And so similar environments should produce a similar effect in populations, even if these populations are genetically different. And all hominins are not that different from each other. Neanderthals are at least tied for our closest relatives in the hominin tree. If you watch my whole breakdown video on the light skin evolution in Homo sapiens, you know how crucial farming was to the dominance of lightening alleles in populations of Europe and Asia. And this caused a whole lot of people to ask, how can I say farming led to white skin if some Neanderthals had light skin? Either the Neanderthals were farmers, or farming isn't the real reason for light skin. And well, it's neither of those. Basically, the main difference here is the time scale. With skin lightening in Homo sapiens starting around 20,000 years ago in the Caucasus, but you don't get near 100% light skin phenotypes in Europe until around 3,000 years ago. It's not until around 1000 BC that just about all Europeans have lighter skin. I'll get into how and why researchers believe this in this video. This relatively rapid change of skin color was due to the increased selection bias from the low vitamin D diets with farming, but light skin did just emerge on its own long before this, and since Neanderthals are in Europe for around 400,000 years, versus Homo sapiens only being there around 45,000 years ago, this near 10x difference meant that even if the selection pressures were less than in the time of farming, you could end up with them looking like white Europeans even if this took 10 times as long. And importantly, that isn't what happened either. It doesn't seem like the Neanderthals of Europe were 100% white people. They seem to have a wide range of phenotypes, from some with red hair and white skin, to some with a medium dark complexion and dark brown eyes and hair. Also importantly, almost 0% of the lightening alleles seen in people today have anything to do with their Neanderthal DNA admixture. White people aren't white because of white Neanderthals. That's all the simplest way to put it. If you're skeptical of any of those points or want to know all the details, let's get into it. Neanderthals inhabited Europe and parts of Western Central Asia for hundreds of thousands of years, roughly 400,000 to 40,000 years ago. And they're going through many ice ages and long periods of intense glacial climates. Intuitively, many anthropologists long assumed that, like modern Europeans, Neanderthals in northern latitudes should have evolved light skin to absorb more UV for vitamin D synthesis. After all, living in regions with weaker sunlight tends to favor less melanin, less pigment in your skin, because even though it increases your risk for sunburn, it's more important to absorb as much vitamin D as possible. People living with high UV in tropical areas, they can have really dark skin and still absorb enough UV to produce vitamin D. And I've covered the exceptions before, but as a general rule, people are darker near the equator and lighter towards the poles, reflecting this UV adaptation trade-off. But over the past few decades, we have had ever-growing genetic data to work with, so it's not just armchair reasoning anymore. The first major piece of this story came in 2007, with scientists sequencing a pigmentation gene from Neanderthal bones. Carl Lalueza-Fox and colleagues retrieved part of the MC1R gene, melanocortin-1 receptor, of two Neanderthal individuals. One about 50,000 years old from Italy, and one about 43,000 years old from Spain. MC1R is a key skin/hair pigment gene, and in Homo sapiens, certain mutations that reduce MC1R function result in red hair and very fair freckled skin. But to the researchers' surprise, both Neanderthal specimens carried the same unique mutation in MC1R. It was a variation that couldn't be found in over 3,700 modern people that were screened for it. So it's on the MC1R gene, but not the same type of mutation found in Homo sapiens. We can tell how it looked by looking at the variation of that gene in people today, but it's just very important to appreciate that it's not the same mutation. It's evidence of convergent evolution. It was the first strong evidence that at least some Neanderthals were fair-skinned and had red hair. But the team estimated that the redhead mutation was not very common. Maybe around only 1% of Neanderthals were redheads. And that's based on population genetic models. And while of course it's a rough estimate, it's also true that redheads are still a very small percentage today. But again, our redheads today are not direct descendants of red-headed Neanderthals. It's just that nature hit on the same solution twice. Or if you want to be even more specific, that similar phenotypic expressions emerge from the single driving factor of trying to synthesize more vitamin D, trying to make the skin lighter, and it ends up expressing itself in these really curious ways. But it's still different evolutionary paths to the same red-headed appearance. But then subsequent research turned to Neanderthal genomes for a broader look at pigmentation genes. By 2010, Svante Pääbo's team had a Neanderthal genome allowing comparisons of many gene variants, and initially they thought that Neanderthals would lack most of the known light skin gene variants seen in modern Europeans, because many of those variants seem to have arisen in our lineage after Neanderthals went extinct, and that is what they seemed to find. A 2012 study by Chao Choqueria and colleagues examined over 100 DNA markers linked to hair, eye, and skin color in humans, and found Neanderthals carried very few of the light alleles common in present-day Europeans. And this led them to conclude that Neanderthals were probably mostly dark-haired, brown-eyed, and medium to dark skin, saying that they would look more like a present-day person from West Asia, or of the darker complexions of the Mediterranean. But then that wasn't the end of the story. As more Neanderthal genomes were sequenced, a more nuanced picture emerged. Researchers discovered that Neanderthals did have some of their own unique pigment variants, and what was fascinating was that a few of those entered the modern human gene pool through interbreeding. The best examples are the two Neanderthal-derived haplotypes, or genetic segments, which are found in modern people and affect pigmentation. One on a gene called OCA2, and another in BNC2. A stretch of Neanderthal DNA around the OCA2 gene, important for eye and skin color, is found in high frequency today, over 60% in East Asians, about 35% in Melanesians and South Asians, and 30% in Europeans. This introgressed Neanderthal haplotype has no known coding changes in OCA2, but contains a variant weakly associated with lighter eye and hair color in Europeans. It's not the primary blue eye mutation, which Neanderthals did not have, but it might subtly affect pigmentation. There is a lot of variation in what we might call brown eyes, from very dark, almost black, to like a light honey. The key point is that its high frequency suggests it gave some selective advantage, perhaps in pigmentation overall or another trait. It could have slightly lightened skin and had effects on other things like eyes and hair. Having blue eyes or blonde or red hair does not help you survive better in terms of vitamin D synthesis, but it pops up when you start having lighter skin, which does have that natural selection pressure. Then the BNC2 gene, basonuclein 2, influences skin pigmentation and freckling. Modern Europeans have two major Neanderthal-derived variants of BNC2. One haplotype is very common, about 70% in Europeans, and is associated with greater susceptibility to sunburn and reduced tanning ability, both traits consistent with lighter skin development. But another Neanderthal BNC2 variant is less common, about 19% in Europeans, and it correlates with darker skin pigmentation. These seemingly opposite effects imply Neanderthals themselves likely had some individuals who tanned poorly and were far lighter skin, and some who were darker, mirroring the diversity of what we still call white people today. Some are very pale white, and some can actually become very tanned into a light brown. The fact that the reduced tanning BNC2 variant is so prevalent in Europeans today, far above the average Neanderthal ancestry proportion, indicates positive selection from the environment. It likely helped early Eurasians adapt to lower UV by diminishing their melanin response. Combining all these findings, researchers realized Neanderthals had a palette of pigmentation genetics, some alleles tending toward lighter phenotypes, like the MC1R redhead variant and the sunburn-prone BNC2, while others tend toward being darker. And they likely had regional and individual variation, reddish hair in a few, brown hair at most, and maybe the occasional light medium brown skin in northern areas, and darker tan skin in southern areas. Eye color is less clear, but based on genetics, brown was probably predominant, since Neanderthals lacked the common modern blue eye mutation. Of course, we can't say it's impossible, maybe it happened via some other route, but there's no evidence to support that it happened. So again, maybe 1% had red hair, and others also likely had very light skin. A majority still could have had light brown to somewhat dark skin, but still many would have had somewhat light skin, just not along the same genes that make modern Europeans light skinned today. While Homo sapiens almost certainly originated in Africa, and almost certainly started off with dark, UV protective skin. When modern humans began dispersing into Eurasia around 60,000 years ago, they would have remained relatively dark-skinned for thousands of years, even at high latitudes, until a series of mutations that were reinforced by their environment created the genetic changes that gradually lightened their complexion, along different gene pathways, and this process didn't happen overnight. The best evidence suggests that even as recently as 8 to 7,000 years ago, the Europeans did not have the fully evolved light skin we see today, with the most important discoveries coming from the genome of a Mesolithic, around 7,000-year-old hunter-gatherer from La Branja, Spain. Researchers found that this individual had blue eyes but very dark skin, and that he carried the ancestral versions of two of the strongest skin pigmentation genes, SLC24A5 and SLC45A2, and the ancestral form of KITLG, showing that he lacked the major lightening alleles common in Europeans today, while having that variant in the HERC2 OCA2 region, which is how you get the blue eye color in modern populations. So dark to olive skin and brown-black hair, and the blue eyes coming way before the light skin. The key takeaway is that light skin alleles had not yet been fixed in that population. SLC24A5 and SLC45A2 are absent or around 0% frequency in this Mesolithic genome, whereas those alleles are around 100% in Europeans today. And so for it to get so common so fast, this indicates a strong positive selection. Genes don't go from near zero to near 100% in just 7,000 years for funsies. It's something in the environment, from something of pure nature like sunlight, or sexual selection, meaning people wanted to breed with people that had some feature, which is the mainstream idea for the rapid spread of blue eyes. And I like to add to that point that people living in this spirit-infused world where everything had some meaning to it, I can't imagine people would think blue eyes were just pretty to look at or some curiosity. Them being unique means they must be special, either especially good or especially bad, and it seems like ancient people thought this mutation was good. People wanted to mate with people that had it and preserve this feature. There's no health boost in the environment like you get with lighter skin. Again, the full deep dive on that is in the light skin evolution vid. If you really don't appreciate all the health issues that can be avoided in low UV farming diet areas just by having lighter skin, once you realize this, you can really see how the reproductive advantage can snowball over just a few thousand years. But remember, latitude alone wasn't enough. For thousands of years, high-latitude human beings remained fairly dark-skinned, probably because they had vitamin D-rich diets from wild game and fish and relatively small populations. The smaller the population, the slower the genetic changes. Farming dramatically increased populations while also lowering vitamin D intake. And so the allele SLC24A5 is thought to have originated around 10 to 19,000 years ago in the Middle East or up into the Caucasus area. Farming increases the selection pressure, and we see it spread all throughout Europe with the Neolithic farmers. One of the most important papers on this was Matheson et al. In 2015, which found that the SLC24A5 derived allele was essentially fixed, meaning it was near 100% in the Anatolian Neolithic farmers. And they're the ones that helped spread it to around 90% frequency in early Neolithic Europe, largely via migration, the incoming farmers interbreeding with local hunter-gatherers. So that's not a Neanderthal gene, and it's not to say that light skin alleles emerged from farming, they were just reinforced by farming. And it's really the second major allele, SLC45A2, which was still rare in Europe up into the late Neolithic and into the Bronze Age about 4,000 years ago. The Yamnaya steppe herders who moved into Europe around 5,000 years ago carried higher frequencies of this allele, and their admixture plus strong selection rapidly drove this allele up. So it's not until the Iron Age, around 1000 BC, that we see the two major skin lightening alleles in Europeans become dominant, become near 100% in Europeans. That's far more recent than most people think. Other research from Wield et al. Also supports this, showing that the uptake of these alleles is remarkably fast, around 2 to 10% per generation, which to be selected for so intensely shows it must be connected to some health benefit, and it's of the same UV vitamin D hypothesis, the same conditions that were in Europe impacting the Neanderthals. Remember what started all this, and in its defense, this common misunderstanding stems from a few seemingly connected facts. Africans have almost no Neanderthal admixture. We see the lightest skinned people in Europe and Asia, and those people have the highest Neanderthal admixture. So if the scientists are saying Neanderthals were white, then they must have gave this trait to Homo sapiens via admixture. But now you can see that this is just the case of convergent evolution plus hundreds of thousands of years in low UV areas, where light skin is advantageous. For Homo sapiens, farming rapidly accelerated the positive selection for light skin. For Neanderthals, random mutations on different alleles were still selected for over 300,000 years, not just 50,000 years, which is the amount of time sapiens are thought to have a lasting presence in Europe. And this variation was not marginal or late emerging, but it was a stable feature of their species, especially in European and Central Asian groups, where long-time exposure to low ultraviolet environments likely shaped melanin production through natural selection and even just genetic drift. If you want some rough estimates to really visualize it, ecological modeling suggests that roughly 50 to 70% of Neanderthals in Europe had light or low melanin skin, supported by the presence of BNC2 haplotypes associated with reducing tanning and the independent emergence of depigmentation mutations, the interactions on the MC1R genes, which gave us those with red hair and freckles. Another 20 to 40% likely had intermediate pigmentation, and around 10 to 20% may have had even darker complexions, especially in southern regions or along the Levant. We've come all this way to say that they basically look like the populations of Europe and the Middle East today, or at least with a similar gradient from northern to southern Europeans. Hair color showed similar diversity. Around 60 to 80% of Neanderthals had brown to dark brown hair. This is probably the default phenotype. Lighter brown or blondish hair may have been around 10 to 20% of people, but again probably concentrated in the northern groups, and affected by things like founder effects and just local genetic drift. The rarest, that MC1R loss of function mutation, giving the red or copperish hair and pale skin, was maybe 5% at most, but many researchers think it's safer to say around just 1%, which would have been very striking but not very common. And it's believed that they most likely all had brown eyes, though it's possible there were a ton of lighter shades, and maybe even blue eyes. You'll see this in a ton of the reconstructions, and I'll be honest, a lot of sources make it seem like this is not possible. But like I said, the general rule is that there's this pressure to develop lighter skin, and in Europeans, those pathways are connected with things like blonde hair, red hair, and blue eyes. And to quote from the paper I showed earlier, the OCA2 gene encodes a transmembrane protein that impacts skin, hair, and iris pigmentation. In other words, it's that gene that's connected to lightening overall. And then it says, quote, specifically, a Neanderthal introgressed allele associated with blue iris pigmentation and blonde and red hair color was under selection in modern human populations. So I think these depictions of blue-eyed Neanderthals seem to be plausible, even if, like every other detail of this, it's happening through different variations. Different variants, even if on the same genes. So I hope that all made sense. Again, it's a whole bunch of research, a whole bunch of nuanced points on the different allele pathways, but at the end of the day, their looks map on to modern European looks pretty well. But at least the skin color gradient is the result of similar mutations in Homo sapiens, because they are living in that same environment, but for so much longer, at least 250,000 years longer. If you made it this far, please hit that like button. I could really use your help, and I'll see you in the next one.